No one in the history of the Ironmark Pack had ever seen it before. Not the oldest Council Lord. Not the Pack historian with 40 years of records. Not the Alpha King himself. 5 royal cubs, heirs to the 5 most powerful bloodlines in the 7 territories, gathered for the first time in a generation for the joint succession trials, moving in perfect formation. Not running wild the way royal cubs ran. Not competing with each other the way alpha bloodlines always competed. Moving together, synchronized, deliberate, like a single unit that had trained for months. And at the front of that formation, not a general, not a senior pack warrior, not anyone the court would have chosen or predicted or approved. Marin, an Omega teacher with chalk on her hands and no pack bond to her name. She turned once over her shoulder and said 2 words. Stay close. And 5 alpha royal cubs, children who had never obeyed anyone without a fight, moved as one. The Alpha King of Ironmark stood at the observation platform above the training ground and felt something happen in his chest that he did not immediately have a name for. Then he did. Recognition. Let me tell you how Marin came to the royal nursery, because the way a thing begins tells you everything about what it is. She did not apply through the formal court appointment process. She did not have letters of recommendation from senior pack scholars, or endorsements from council lords, or the kind of credentials that the Ironmark Royal Household's Education Committee considered relevant. She arrived because the previous teacher had quit, the 3rd one in 8 months, and the committee was out of options, and the cubs were currently confined to their quarters after an incident involving a training dummy, a significant quantity of stored cooking oil, and what the incident report diplomatically described as unauthorized combustion. The head of the Education Committee, Lord Torvus, had been refusing to consider Marin's application for 6 weeks, on the grounds that an unbonded Omega with no formal academy credentials was not an appropriate educator for royal heirs. On the morning of the combustion incident, Lord Torvus sent for her. She arrived 20 minutes later with her teaching satchel already packed. Torvus looked at her, at the satchel, at her. You knew we'd call you, he said. I knew you'd run out of everyone else, she said. Where are they? She was 25 years old, dark-haired, practical-faced, with ink stains on her left hand that she'd apparently stopped trying to remove at some point, and simply accepted. She was an Omega, no pack bond, no formal bloodline standing, the kind of person the court calendar never made room for. She had spent 3 years teaching in the border settlement schools, where classrooms had 40 students in 6 languages, and approximately no resources, and where the only way to maintain order was to be more interesting than chaos. She was, by every account that wasn't Lord Torvus's, extraordinary at it. They're in the East Wing, Torvus said. I should warn you. I read the incident reports, Marin said. All 8 months of them. All 6 of them? 8. I requested the ones that were classified. Torvus opened his mouth, closed it. Good luck, he said in the tone of someone who did not believe luck was going to be sufficient. The 5 cubs were in the East Wing common room when Marin arrived, which was a charitable description of the situation. More precisely, 2 of them were on top of the furniture. 1 was underneath it. 1 was in the corner performing what appeared to be a systematic destruction of a bookshelf, and 1, the smallest, who she would later learn was also the most dangerous, was sitting in the precise center of the room watching the door with the patient, calculating attention of something that had decided to assess before it acted. Marin stood in the doorway for a moment. She did not announce herself, did not try to establish authority with volume or posture. She simply looked at all 5 of them with the steady, interested attention of someone taking inventory. Sale, eldest son of the Stonecrest bloodline, 9 years old, currently on top of the main table with his arms crossed. Incident reports described him as resistant to instruction and prone to challenging authority figures. Translation: smart enough to be bored, and bored enough to be destructive. Fen, second heir of the Duskwood lineage, 8 years old, occupying the space under the table with what appeared to be a collection of small mechanical objects in various states of disassembly. Incident reports, easily distracted, does not attend to group instruction. Translation: intensely curious about how things worked and completely uninterested in things that didn't. Orin, third heir of the Coldwater Pack, 8 years old, systematically removing books from the shelf and stacking them in a pattern that was, Marin noted, not random. It had structure. Reports described him as willfully disruptive. She suspected unstimulated was closer. Liz, only daughter in the group, second heir of the Greywood bloodline, 9 years old, sitting on the windowsill with her back to the room and her face to the glass. Reports, withdrawn, unresponsive to group activities. Something in her posture suggested she was not withdrawn. She was managing, doing the internal work of being surrounded by people who didn't understand her, and making herself as small as possible to reduce the friction. Marin recognized that. She had done it herself for most of her childhood. And then Kale, 5 years old, Alpha King's youngest son, sitting in the center of the room watching her. She met his eyes. He had his father's gray eyes, his father's quality of complete, undivided, reading attention. "You're the new one," he said. "Yes. How long until you quit?" "I haven't decided to quit yet. The last one said that too." "I'm aware." Marin set her satchel down. "I read his resignation letter. He said you were unteachable. I don't believe that. I think you've been bored and mismanaged and given nothing worth paying attention to." The room went quiet. "What I think," she continued, pulling her teaching materials from the satchel, "is that all 5 of you are extraordinarily capable and have been spending 8 months proving it in the only direction available. I intend to give you a different direction." Sale looked down from the table. "You're an Omega." "Yes. Our previous teachers were all senior Beta scholars with Academy credentials." "Yes. And you drove all of them away in under 6 months combined. Would you like to keep doing that, or would you like to try something different?" Sale stared at her. Then he got down from the table. Not in submission, in curiosity. She had said something unexpected, and he was the kind of child who needed to investigate unexpected things. She could work with that. "Sit down," she said. "All of you. We're going to find out what you actually know, which I suspect is considerably more than anyone has given you credit for." Kale watched her from the center of the room for another long moment. Then he sat. The others followed. It was not immediate. It was not smooth. Fenn stayed under the table for the first 20 minutes, and she let him, because he was listening, even if he wasn't visible, and forcing the issue would have cost her his trust for a month. But they sat. And Marin began. The first month was difficult. Not because the cubs were unkind. They were not, particularly, once the initial testing period ended, and they understood she was neither going to crumble, nor perform the kind of brittle authority that invited dismantling. They were difficult in the way that highly intelligent, understimulated, socially complicated children are difficult. Constantly, inventively, and with a creativity that she found genuinely impressive, even when it was aimed at undermining her lesson plan. She abandoned the lesson plan within the first week. Not the goals? The goals were the goals. They needed to learn history, strategy, pack law, negotiation, physical discipline. But the structure that her predecessors had used, lectures, recitation, formal examination, was designed for children who wanted to succeed within the system, and none of these 5 had any particular reason to want that yet. She taught Sale history through argument. She would state a position. The Greywood succession of 4 generations ago was handled correctly, and let him destroy it, which he did exhaustively and with considerable research that he conducted entirely on his own initiative, because he wanted to win. When he'd finished dismantling her position, she'd say, "Good. Now defend it." And he'd sputter and argue, and eventually do it, because his pride wouldn't let him fail at something he'd already started. She taught Fenn through construction. Every concept had a physical model. Pack law became a mechanical system with movable parts that represented different clauses and their interactions. Strategy became topographic models he built himself. He worked for 6 hours once without looking up, modeling the entire Coldwater border dispute with carved wood pieces and a string grid, and when he finished, he had understood the resolution better than most council apprentices twice his age. She taught Orin through pattern. He was a systems thinker, everything connected to everything else in his mind, and the connections were what mattered. She gave him histories and let him find the threads, gave him case studies, and asked, "What does this remind you of?" and watched him light up every single time. Lys she approached last and most carefully. The girl was gifted in a way that the incident reports had completely missed, because they were written by people who didn't know what they were looking at. She wasn't withdrawn. She was observational. She processed the world at a depth and speed that meant she'd usually understood a situation completely before anyone else had finished reacting to it, and she'd learned to stay quiet about that, because the reactions when she shared her conclusions were rarely kind. Maren started sitting beside her during lessons instead of in front of her, started asking her questions privately instead of in the group, giving her the choice of when to bring something forward. Started, carefully, creating moments where Lys's observations were necessary rather than optional. Situations where the group needed what she saw, and it became gradually apparent to everyone that she was the one who saw it. Lys started speaking in the 3rd week. By the 6th, she was the one the others went to when they couldn't figure something out. And Kale, the youngest, the Alpha King's son, the one who had sat in the center of the room on the first day watching her with his father's eyes, was her shadow. He followed her everywhere she was permitted to be in the royal wing. He sat beside her at every lesson. He asked questions constantly, not to challenge, not to test, but because he genuinely wanted to know things, and had somehow identified her as the person most likely to give him real answers. She gave him real answers. He was 5 years old and he deserved real answers. One morning, 6 weeks in, he appeared at the teaching room door before the others had arrived and said, "Can I ask you something?" "Always," she said. "Why are you nicer to us than the other teachers were?" She set down the materials she was preparing and looked at him directly. "I'm not nicer," she said. "I expect more from you than any of them did. I just don't confuse difficulty with misbehavior." He thought about this. What's the difference? Misbehavior is when someone knows what's right and chooses otherwise. Difficulty is when someone hasn't been shown the right way yet. You were never misbehaving. You were just waiting for someone to show you something worth doing. Kale was quiet for a long moment. "My father says I'm difficult," he said. "Your father says a lot of things from a distance," Maren said, before she'd quite decided to. Then she paused. "I probably shouldn't have said that." "No, it's true," Kale said. "He does everything from a distance." She looked at him, 5 years old, with his father's eyes and his mother's absence written somewhere in his posture, in the way he'd attached himself to the first adult in the royal wing who had simply stayed. "You're not difficult," she said. "You're 5 years old, and you're very smart, and you're trying very hard. That's all." He nodded once, seriously. Then he sat down and waited for the others. The idea started with Sael. They were in the 3rd month, running what Maren called field lessons, practical work outside the teaching room, applying concepts to real situations. That day's lesson was pack movement, how a cohesive unit moved through contested territory, the principles of spacing and communication and mutual awareness. She had been using them as a group, running the exercise, when Sael stopped in the middle of the practice field and said, "This would work better if we were spread differently." "Show me what you mean," Maren said. He moved himself to a position, gestured Fen to another, repositioned Orin, thought about it, put Lys on the left flank, looked at Kale. "You're the fastest," he said to his younger packmate. It was the first time Maren had heard him acknowledge another cub's capability without competition in it. "Center rear. You can respond to either side." Kale went to center rear without argument. The formation that resulted was, Maren noted quietly, structurally sound. Better than she would have arranged them herself given the individual capabilities she'd been watching for 3 months. "Move," she said. They moved. It wasn't perfect. Fen kept drifting to look at interesting things in the periphery, and Orin needed occasional signals to maintain his spacing, but the core of it was real. They were aware of each other in a way they hadn't been before. They adjusted. They communicated without talking, through the small pack signals that alpha bloodlines carried instinctively, but needed to learn to use consciously. "Again," she said. Same formation, tighter spacing. They did it again, and again. She started bringing it into every physical lesson after that. Not forcing the formation, offering it as a tool, letting them discover that it worked better than individual effort for certain tasks. Sale refined the positioning over weeks. Liss, from her flank, developed a signaling system, small gestures that communicated information across the formation without breaking movement. Fenn, once he understood what the formation was for, applied his mechanical understanding to optimizing it, treating the group as a system with specific load-bearing capacities. Orin was the one who named it. "We're a pack," he said one afternoon after a particularly clean run through the obstacle course she'd built in the training yard. A real one, not just cubs in the same building. The others were quiet for a moment. "Yes," Marin said. "You are." Cale looked at her. "You made us one." "No," she said. "I showed you what you already were. You made yourselves one." She meant it. She had given them tools and space and the specific kind of patient attention that lets things grow at their own pace. But the formation was theirs. The trust between them was theirs. She had not built it. She had created conditions where it could build itself. That distinction mattered to her. She did not know about Lord Torvis's plan until the day it was implemented. He had been watching the teaching program for 3 months with the focused attention of a man who has been wrong about something and is looking for evidence that he wasn't. He had not found that evidence. What he had found instead was something that annoyed him considerably more. Evidence that Marin was succeeding where his credentialed appointees had failed, and that her success was becoming visible to people whose visibility mattered. The Alpha King had begun attending the weekly progress reports, not sending a representative, attending himself. Torvis understood what this meant. He spent 2 weeks building his case and then brought it formally to the Education Committee. Marin's appointment was irregular, her credentials insufficient for continued royal instruction. Her methods, he had spoken to 3 former Academy scholars who had reviewed her lesson plans and found them unorthodox, were inappropriate for the formation of future pack leaders. He had the votes. He'd gathered them quietly, in the way that men like Torvis gathered things, through favors and pressure and the specific social leverage of someone who had been in his position long enough to know what everyone owed him. The committee voted on a Tuesday morning. Marin was informed that afternoon. "Effective immediately," the committee notice said. "Pending review, Instructor Marin is relieved of duties in the Royal Education Program. A replacement will be appointed within the fortnight." She read it twice. Then she went to the teaching room, empty, the cubs in their afternoon physical training, and sat for a long time with her hands in her lap. She thought about Liss, who had started speaking in the 3rd week, about Fenn, who had spent 6 hours building a model of the Coldwater border dispute because he wanted to understand it, about Orin saying we're a pack, a real one, about Cale, 5 years old, asking her why she was nicer than the others. She thought about going, taking the notice at face value, walking away, finding another border settlement school that needed a teacher with ink on her hands and no formal credentials. She thought about what she would be leaving behind. She did not cry. She had learned in years of being underestimated and dismissed that crying in the face of institutional decisions was a luxury she couldn't afford. Not because it was weak, but because it changed nothing and cost her the energy she needed for what came next. She folded the notice, put it in her satchel, and went to find the cubs. She told them herself. She owed them that. She was not going to let them find out from a guard or a household announcement. They were coming in from afternoon training, still warm and disheveled, Sale arguing with Orin about something, Fenn carrying a rock he'd found interesting, Liss listening to both sides of the argument with the expression she wore when she was deciding whether to intervene. Cale saw her face first. He always did. He stopped. "What happened?" She told them. The room went very quiet. Sile's jaw tightened. Torvis. It was a committee decision. Torvis runs the committee. Everyone knows that. Sale looked at her with the specific, cold fury of a 9-year-old who has learned what injustice looks like and has not yet learned to be strategic about his response. "He can't do this." "He did," Marin said. "We'll tell my father," Cale said. "That's not how it works. The Education Committee." "My father is the Alpha King. He doesn't have to care how it works." "Cale, You told me that misbehavior is when you know what's right and choose otherwise. His gray eyes were very direct, very certain. Is this right? She could not answer that. No, she said finally. It isn't right. Then we're not accepting it. The joint succession trials were scheduled for the following week. The 5-pack gathering happened once a generation, when young heirs came together for the formal assessment that determined their standing and sequence in the inter-pack succession protocols. It was ceremonial in the way of things that had been important once and were now mostly theater, but it was public, formal, and heavily attended. Every senior lord from every pack would be present, including Lord Torvus, including the Alpha King. Marin did not know what the cubs were planning. They had not told her, which in retrospect she should have identified as a significant warning sign. She was technically still in the royal wing. The committee had given her a week before the effective removal, and she'd stayed because the cubs had asked her to, and because she hadn't finished transferring her teaching materials. She was in the teaching room on the morning of the trials, sorting notes, trying not to think about what was happening in the assessment ground 2 courtyards over. Then Cale appeared in the doorway. "Come to the viewing platform," he said. "I'm not supposed to. Please." She went. Alpha King Davon Ironmark was standing at the observation platform above the assessment ground when the 5 cubs entered the field below. He had been watching joint succession trials since his own childhood. He knew what they looked like. 5 royal heirs from 5 different bloodlines, entering separately, competing individually, demonstrating their individual standing in the eyes of their respective packs. What entered the field was not that. They came in through the single entrance together. Sael at the front, the eldest, the most naturally commanding, and he was not performing command. He was moving with an ease that looked like certainty, because he had spent 3 months being led by someone who had shown him what certainty without ego looked like, and he had learned the shape of it. Fen and Orin flanking left and right, spacing clean and deliberate. Liss on the far left with her particular quality of watching everything at once. The flank guardian who didn't look like a guardian until you needed one. And Cale in the center rear position that Sael had assigned him 3 months ago, and that he had inhabited ever since, the fastest, the most responsive, the center of the whole arrangement's ability to adapt. They stopped in the center of the assessment ground. They were not looking at the judges. They were looking at the viewing platform. At the specific section of the viewing platform where Lord Torvus stood, with his committee colleagues, in the formal placement of people who expected to observe. And at the other section, where the Alpha King stood, having arrived at the platform from the opposite direction 3 minutes earlier, accompanied only by his personal aide. The assessment ground was full of observers. Every senior lord, every pack representative, every court official who had been invited to witness the succession trials. All of them watching. Marin stood at the back of the platform, behind the formal observers, where she had no assigned position. She saw Cale look up. He found her immediately, the same way he always found her, the specific, focused quality of someone who knows exactly where to look. He said nothing, but the question was clear. "Ready?" She didn't say it aloud. She didn't need to. She simply nodded. Cale looked at Sael. Some communication passed between them that Marin didn't see but felt, the specific warmth of a unit operating in sync. Sael turned to face the platform, and in a voice pitched to carry, clear and deliberate in the way of someone who has practiced this, he said, "Before the trials begin, the heirs of the 5 packs have a request for the Alpha King and the assembled council." A murmur went through the crowd. Joint succession heirs did not address the council before the trials. It was not done. The Alpha King had not moved. His expression was unreadable in the way of a man who has learned to keep his face still while his mind works very fast. "Speak," he said. "Our instruction has been terminated," Sael said. "By a committee decision, our teacher was removed from her position. We believe this decision was wrong. We are asking that it be reviewed by someone with the authority to overturn it." Torvus stepped forward on the platform. His voice was controlled, but barely. "This is not appropriate, Lord Torvus." The Alpha King's voice was quiet. The kind of quiet that moved through a room the way cold moves through a gap in the wall, not loud, but felt everywhere. The air spoke, "You will wait." Torvus went still. Kadrin looked at the 5 cubs below, at the formation, at the stillness of it, at the 5 different bloodlines standing side by side with the ease of a unit that had learned to trust. He had never seen anything like it in his life. "Continue," he said to Sayel. "Our teacher has no formal academy credentials," Sayel said. "She was appointed informally because the committee ran out of options. She taught us for 4 months. In that time, we learned more than in the 3 years before her combined. We learned differently, and we learned how to be—" He paused for the briefest moment. "We learned how to be a pack." Silence. The Alpha King's eyes moved to the back of the platform. Moved with the specific quality of a man who already knows what he's looking for. He found Marin. She was standing where she'd been standing since she arrived, at the back, where she had no position, trying to be as invisible as possible, failing in the specific way that people who have spent their lives being underestimated sometimes fail to be invisible when they've been seen by the right person. Their eyes met. He looked at her for a long moment. She did not look away. She had learned in 4 months of teaching royal cubs that looking away communicated things you didn't mean. "Bring her forward," the Alpha King said. Someone guided her, she barely registered who, through the formal observers to the front of the platform. She stopped at the railing. Below, 5 cubs watched her. The Alpha King turned to her. "Lord Torvus tells me your credentials are insufficient," he said. "He's not wrong," she said. "I have no formal academy certification. I have 3 years in border settlement schools, and 4 months with your son." "And in 4 months with my son, you apparently produced this." A gesture toward the assessment ground below. "They produced it," she said. "I gave them the conditions. They made the choices." He looked at her for another moment. "That distinction," he said, "is itself a credential." He turned to Torvus. "The committee's decision is overturned," he said. "Instructor Marin's appointment is confirmed, permanently, with full standing and resource access. If the committee has concerns about her methods, they are welcome to observe her lessons and explain to me afterward what they object to." Torvus opened his mouth. "Lord Torvus," Kadrin said, still in that quiet voice. "I will not repeat myself." Torvus closed his mouth. Below, in the assessment ground, Kale was watching the platform. He saw the moment it resolved. He did not hear the words, too far. But he read Torvus's face, and he read Marin's face, and he read his father's posture. He turned to Sayel. Sayel nodded. Kale looked up at the platform, at Marin, and he smiled, the full, uncomplicated smile of a 5-year-old who has watched something he cared about be protected. Marin's throat did something she didn't try to control. She looked at all 5 of them, Sale and Fen and Orin and Liss and Kale, standing in the formation they'd built themselves in the field lessons, and the training yard, and the months of becoming something more than 5 cubs in the same building. She lifted her hand. "Stay close," she said. Not a command. The words they used at the start of every field lesson, the signal that meant, "We're a unit now, move as one." Below her, 5 royal heirs, 5 different bloodlines, 5 different packs, the most politically complicated gathering of young alpha bloods in a generation, moved into formation, in perfect synchrony. Every observer on the platform and in the gallery, and at the assessment ground perimeter, went completely still. The Alpha King, standing 2 feet to Marin's left, watched his son take his center rear position with the focused, confident ease of a cub who knew exactly where he belonged. He was quiet for a long moment. "How?" he said very quietly. "Just for her. How did you do it?" "I showed them they were capable," she said. "And then I got out of the way." He looked at her sidelong. The gray eyes, the same ones his son had inherited, were doing the reading thing, the full attention thing. The thing she'd noticed about Kale from the first day, and now understood, was simply a Devon family quality. "You didn't get out of the way," he said. You stayed. She looked at the formation below. That's different, she said. Tell me how. She was quiet for a moment. Getting out of the way means leaving. Staying means being present without taking over. They needed someone to be there, not someone to control them. Just there. Available. Consistent. She paused. Most people couldn't tell the difference. Could you always? She thought about it honestly. I learned it the same way they did. Someone showed me the difference between being managed and being seen. I never forgot it. He was quiet. Below them, the formation ran its first assessment pass, the formal trial beginning now, the judges moving into position, the crowd finding their attention sharpening from ceremonial interest to something more genuine. The 5 cubs moved in the easy, practiced way of a unit that did not need to think about whether the person beside them would hold. They knew. She's remarkable, the Alpha King said, quietly, still watching the field below. Marin thought he meant Liss, who had just executed a flank movement with the specific fluid grace of someone who'd spent months becoming exactly herself. She is, Marin agreed. They all are. He turned to look at her. I meant you, he said. She met his eyes, and did not, for once, look away. The trials concluded by afternoon. The 5 cubs were not assessed individually, which caused the judges considerable procedural difficulty, because the joint succession format had never accounted for the possibility of heirs who refused to compete separately. They had brought the question to the Alpha King, who had said, assess them as they present themselves, which was not traditional, but was definitive. The assessment, conducted as a unit evaluation rather than individual trials, produced results that the formal report would later describe as unprecedented in 6 different sections, and leave to future scholars to classify. Lord Torvus filed a formal objection. It was rejected. He filed it again, with additional supporting documentation. It was rejected again. He began preparing a 3rd filing. Commander Ryn visited him privately and explained that the Alpha King had a very specific expression that meant a decision was final, and that he had been wearing that expression since approximately the moment he'd seen 5 royal heirs move in formation, and that the wisest course of action for everyone involved was to redirect his considerable organizational energy toward something more promising. Torvus did not file a 3rd objection. Marin's appointment was formalized the following week. Not confirmed, formalized, with the specific documentation that gave it standing beyond committee review, beyond the next regime change, beyond Lord Torvus, or anyone like him. The Alpha King had been thorough. She received the paperwork on a Tuesday morning. She was in the teaching room when it arrived, mid-lesson, because she had not stopped teaching for the paperwork to be processed, and had no intention of doing so. Fen looked up from the model he was building. What is it? Documentation, she said. What kind? The permanent kind. Orin grinned. Liss made a small sound that was her version of enthusiasm. Sale looked satisfied in the particular way of someone whose plan has succeeded. Kale climbed onto the table beside her materials, something she had told him 4 times not to do, and had stopped actually enforcing because he did it anyway, and it didn't seem to cause genuine harm, and looked at the paperwork. It has my father's seal, he said. Yes. He doesn't put his seal on things unless he means them. Good to know. Kale looked at her. He asked about you. Last night at dinner. He asked what you were teaching us this week. And? I told him about the river crossing negotiation problem. He tilted his head. He said it was a good problem. Marin carefully did not react to this. Off the table, she said. He got off the table. She looked at all 5 of them. Sale at his work, Fen constructing, Orin finding the pattern, Liss observing, Kale watching her with his father's eyes, and felt something she did not entirely have words for. Not pride, too simple. Not love, exactly, though she would not have said it wasn't that. Something closer to, this is what I was made for, and I found it, and it is enough. And also somehow it is more than enough, and I am going to hold this very carefully because things this real are breakable. She picked up her materials. "Pack movement review," she said. "Sale, you're on the formation design today. Fen, I want you thinking about optimal spacing for 3 versus 5 members. Liz, I want you watching what happens to the flank coverage when Fen pulls left." "And me?" Cale asked. "You're observing today. Take notes. Tell me what you see that none of them see." He straightened, took his notebook with the absolute seriousness of a 5-year-old who has been given a real responsibility. "Can I ask you something first?" "You always can." "Is my father going to come to the lessons?" She paused. "I don't know," she said. "Would you want him to?" Cale thought about it carefully. "I think he should see what we can do," he said. "He doesn't know yet." "What doesn't he know?" "That we're good," Cale said, simply. "That we're really good. He's only seen the old reports." Marin looked at him. "I'll mention it," she said. "To him or to us?" "Both," she said. "Pack movement, formation positions. Let's go." They moved. And in the doorway, she was almost certain, though she did not turn to look, she heard the quiet sound of someone arriving. Someone who had, perhaps, been standing in doorways watching from a distance for a long time, and was considering, carefully, whether it was time to come inside. She kept her eyes on the 5 cubs in formation. "Stay close," she said. They did. She had no credentials, no pack bond, no formal standing. She had chalk on her hands and border settlement schools in her past, and the specific, irreplaceable knowledge of what it felt like to be underestimated. She walked into a room of 5 children that 4 teachers had failed, and she saw them. Not what they were doing wrong, what they were, and she stayed. That's all. She stayed, and everything else followed.